have come and participated in this, and so we're so happy that we continue to do this. And we'll close this door right now. So that. Thanks, George. George has got a loud voice, and I have a soft one. So this is journeying through the wilderness, and journeying through the wilderness as seen through different religious traditions. And so again, why are we doing this as a Christian church, engaging in this dialogue in the season of Lent? Well, we've all been through a period of wilderness, regardless of what faith tradition we're part of. We're Christian, we're Jewish, we're Islamic, we're Buddhist, Hindu. We've all been through this pandemic experience, and it has been a period of wilderness, a period of wandering. And in this period, God has still come and engaged with us and leads us. And so it was really wonderful to have to be able to be connected with great teachers of different traditions, to see how those different traditions have navigated this experience of wilderness. I want to in particular thank Joel Lohr. Joel is standing right, or sitting right there, and Joel is the. Joel, you're a very tall man. I'm standing, and you're sitting, and we're almost the same height. I just look up to you, and I want to be you. But Joel is really a wonderful man. He is the president and professor of biblical studies at Harvard International University in Religion and Peace. Joel started to come to our church. We connected, and I spoke about this idea with him, and we flushed it out, and he gave us the opportunity to meet two really wonderful speakers. Bilal Ansari, which you heard already, he was amazing. He really spoke to us from the heart about Islam and his experience of Islam as their call for prayer called all people to turn toward God. And today we have Dr. Yehezkel Landau. Dr. Landau is a dual Israeli-American citizen and an interfaith educator, leadership trainer, author, and consultant working to improve Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations and promotes Israeli and Palestinian peace building for over 40 years. He knows our former presiding bishop, the Most Reverend Frank Griswold. They've been in conversation even in reference to this particular program, and I was just so happy to hear that. Dr. Landau earned his Bachelor of Arts from Harvard University, a Master of Theology Studies from Harvard Divinity School, and a Doctorate of Ministry degree from Hartford Seminary. And from 2002 to 2016, Dr. Landau was a professor of Jewish tradition and interfaith relations at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace in Connecticut, where he held the chair in Abrahamic Partnerships and directed the Building Abrahamic Partnerships, a training program for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. He also, after that, he continues to facilitate and do workshops with, but also the Merrimack College as well. And he is a delightful man with a great deal of wisdom, and you will find him charming and maybe disarming, because he might make us think in a different way. And so I thank you for being with us, Dr. Landau, and please come and join us.
Shalom, everyone. Shalom. Thank you, Father Sunil, for your generous introduction, and all of you for your gracious hospitality, and Joel Lohr for making the connection for me with this parish. and all of you, and I'm delighted to be here during Lent as you prepare for Holy Week and Easter Sunday, and we in the Jewish community prepare to go out of Egypt again on Seder night, which coincides with Good Friday, once again, as it did in 2015, and I'll reflect on that synchronicity. It's a delight and an honor to be here, and it gives me an opportunity to reclaim one of my sub-identities, which is as an honorary Anglican, thanks to my 20-plus years of teaching at St. George's College in Jerusalem. How many of you have been to the Holy City?
And at St. George's too.
And at St. George's, well, good for you. That's great. That's great. And I miss being there physically. My son, daughter-in-law, and one-year-old granddaughter live in Givatayim, Israel, just next to Tel Aviv. And I got to meet little Ella, Michelle, for the first time last July for 2 weeks. And then with my life partner, Joyce, got to spend 10 days with the family there in November. So I met a host of Anglicans, including Episcopalians, through St. George's, and it's been really a blessing for me every day of my life. Now, underneath this vicarious identity is a more, let's say, it's not vicarious, it's really deep within me. I call myself a Juman being. To do justice to my particular Jewish identity and my universal human one, and I try to keep the two in balance. So as I reflect on your theme for this Lenten season, I want to piece together a three-part reflection. And normally what I like to do is just look at people in the eye, as I'm doing now, and speak spontaneously from my heart and mind and spirit. Because our time is limited, and there are certain things I do want to offer to you and not meander and go on tangents, I'm going to share with you what I have prepared. Okay? And I'll still look at you and see how it's coming across, because I know what I think, but I don't know what you think. And I want to leave enough time for a conversation. Okay, so the theme is a journey through the wilderness. So I'd like to address how we humans orient ourselves in both time and space. And my primary focus for considering the temporal dimension, which we all share, and we can't fight over the way we can fight over space, especially holy places and lands and cities. The primary focus for me is the convergence this year of sacred times of fasting and feasting for Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the coming weeks. For the spatial dimension, I want to examine the connection between two complementary physical and spiritual domains. First, the wilderness or the desert, and then the holy city of Jerusalem, which was my physical home for 24 years, from 1978 to 2002, when I returned to the U.S. to assume my faculty position at what was then Hartford Seminary, and now Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. But Jerusalem was my spiritual home even before I showed up there for the first time, which was around now, several days before Passover in 1978, and it is still my spiritual home today. So I can add to my existential portfolio the identity of Yerushalmi, or Jerusalemite. Now, just as an aside, when I visited Nigeria for 8 days in December of 2010 and talked with Christian and Muslim leaders in advance of an election campaign, which was violent, which is why 3 of us showed up, a Franciscan friar from Sarajevo, a Shiite Pakistani American Muslim, and myself, as a kind of Abrahamic trio. And I got to blow my shofar, my ram's horn, on national television to celebrate their 50th anniversary as an independent nation, their Jubilee year. I found out that the way Muslims like to add Haji as a descriptor for their identity, they've gone on the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lives, the Hajj. In Nigeria, Christians who visited Jerusalem as pilgrims got to add JP to their business cards, Jerusalem Pilgrim. Didn't know that, did you? I didn't before I showed up there. Cheers. That's blessing God for bringing everything into being. So, moving to Israel, becoming an Israeli, living in Jerusalem, that existential transition was really motivated by two primary factors. My desire to put my body where my prayers had already taken me, because we pray facing Jerusalem 3 times a day. And so I got to align my personal journey with the collective homecoming of my people in the last century, and my commitment to not just pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but to work every day for it to happen, as the psalmist enjoins us to do. So we can talk about how to create a just peace between Israel and Palestine. This no-win, unholy war has sapped the spirits and of so many people. So added to the physical harm is this spiritual malaise, and I would even say collective pathology. In fact, on my business card and my website, the tagline is creating spiritual remedies for our social pathologies. That's what I am striving to do. So first, the temporal dimension. So I mentioned that on April 15th, Good Friday, we will also begin the festival of Passover with the Seder meal that night. And both sacred occasions will occur within the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, which begins this coming Monday. So the Muslims will beat us both this year. This convergence of times for Christians, Jews, and Muslims is a threefold blessing. And during my years in Jerusalem, when the 3 seasons, either at Christmas, Hanukkah time, or Passover, Easter time, since Ramadan moves 11 days up every year, since Muslims follow the lunar calendar, so there's a 11-day discrepancy between the solar calendar and the lunar one. Ramadan can be at any time of the year and can overlap with any of our festivals. So being in Jerusalem with its physical aura of holiness, and when the temporal dimension would bring the 3 traditions together, I rejoiced because these overlapping rhythms of consecration would just amplify any of them. 1 alone, okay. 2, better. 3, best. Now, the last time Good Friday and the Passover Seder coincided was in 2015, and as I mentioned, and at that time I wrote a reflection for an Italian Catholic website to mark the occasion, which I will build upon here. 2015 was also the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, this watershed conciliar document from the Second Vatican Council. How many of you were aware of that? Just Catholics probably more than Episcopalians, but it was a historic occasion, and it ushered in a new era in Christian Jewish, and especially Catholic Jewish relations, by decrying the sin of anti-Semitism and repudiating the deicide charge against the Jews that crucified Christ, and this charge had haunted, I would say contaminated, relations between the two faith communities for many centuries. The Catholic Church led the way for Christianity generally, taking a major step in cleansing its official theology of both anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. We can talk about the difference later. They overlap, but they're distinct. The Protestant and Anglican churches followed suit in subsequent years. As a Jew who's been active for decades in the field of interfaith engagement, I recognize how historic and transformative Nostra Aetate was and still is. I know that some Christians, especially in the Eastern Orthodox churches, are slower or more reluctant to embrace the new paradigm in Christian-Jewish relations. But for the majority of Protestants, Catholics, and Anglicans, Jews no longer serve, thank God, as the foil, if not the demonic enemy, in the gospel story of Jesus' passion, crucifixion, and resurrection. This profound transformation, or to use a Greek word from the New Testament, this metanoia in Christian faith understanding, is to be celebrated. And I do. Thank God for that amazing historic transformation. No longer do Jews have to tremble in fear on Good Friday, lest the local priest incite his followers to hatred and violence against their Jewish neighbors for the alleged crime of killing God on a cross. Crucifixion was a Roman method of execution, but the Jews, not the ancient Romans, especially after Constantine made it the Holy Roman Empire, they weren't going to blame themselves. The Jews were tragically scapegoated as Christ killers over the course of 2 millennia. For the Jews of Europe before 1965, Good Friday did not bring any good news. The cross, seen by faithful Christians as a salvific symbol of divine reconciliation with humanity, was turned into a weapon by people who thought of themselves as faithful Christians, even popes, leading crusades, to murder and terrorize the members of Jesus' own people during the centuries of politically empowered Christendom. Christians and Jews alike can be thankful to God that this painful paradox, or contradiction even, that's for you to decide, has finally been supplanted by more inclusively compassionate and historically accurate Christian interpretations of what happened on the hill of Golgotha almost 2,000 years ago. Surmounting this theological hurdle has opened up exciting possibilities for Jews and Christians to learn from one another. And as an interreligious educator, this gives me great joy, tremendous gratification. I brought some books that reflect this new era and paradigm, ways of thinking, feeling, believing, practicing, and you can find them on that table behind Simi with the light blue tablecloth. The communities, our two communities, while retaining their spiritual identities and loyalties, can now appreciate how their respective stories of liberation and redemption can be mutually instructive, even inspirational. We can read the Passover and Easter stories without imposing self-referencing and preferencing interpretations on one or the other. We can together explore the suffering servant passages in Isaiah chapters 52, 53, and hear why Christians see Jesus on the cross in that portrayal, while Jews, basing ourselves on earlier references in Isaiah to God's servant Jacob, tend to see the people Israel allegorized in those prophetic texts. Such a more inclusive and generous approach to sacred stories and to discipleship nurtured by those scriptural accounts is a truly liberating opportunity for all of us. An opportunity that our ancestors were denied by the limitations of history and by restrictive communal identities and loyalties. I try to appreciate the Lenten journey undertaken by my Christian sisters and brothers as such a path of discipleship, a devotional act of imitatio Christi. Even though I don't view Jesus as divine or as the Messiah anticipated by most Jews, he is nonetheless one of my most influential rabbis, Jewish teachers. I see him as a Galilean rabbi and faith healer at the radical edge of the Pharisaic spectrum, calling his fellow Jews, in particular the lost sheep of the house of Israel, to a more heart-centered way of living out the Torah. I resonate with such an understanding of the Sinai covenant and its imperatives for us as Jews and as human beings. Unfortunately, too many Christians still see Torah, which means divine teaching or instruction, as a legalistic framework that was supplanted by the gospel of love. The translation of Torah into New Testament Greek as nomos, or law, helped to engender this misunderstanding and perpetuate it. In my view, the perceived dichotomy between law and love remains the greatest stumbling block in healing the tragic divide separating Christians and Jews. As we Jews prepare to symbolically leave Egypt once again and receive the Torah at Sinai 50 days later, celebrated on the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, which parallels Pentecost in your calendar, and as Christians prepare for Easter and the good news of the resurrection, let us appreciate the saving grace in both faith traditions. For both are blessed by God in ways we cannot fully fathom. The survival of the Jewish people as a prophetic and priestly community dispersed throughout the world is an amazing miracle. I don't think any secular discipline in the academy can account for it. The global witness of the universal church as a vessel of sacrificial service to all of humanity is also a manifestation of transcendent love and goodness. Sadly, very sadly, at this critical moment in our history, both Jews and Christians are being targeted by Islamist extremists who don't understand either of our religious communities in this way. Conversely, Muslims are viewed generically by many Christians and Jews as inherently hostile and threatening. This painful reality of mutual antagonism should impel us to uphold simultaneously two faith responses that are often in tension. The first is compassion for misguided adversaries who, in the words of the dying Jesus, deserve forgiveness, for they know not what they do. And at the same time, a commitment to inclusive justice and the protection of vulnerable human beings who are endangered by murderous hatred. And I want to insert here something I should have said at the beginning. I want to offer or dedicate my remarks to the suffering servant people of Ukraine and all refugees on this planet. Over 70 million people are strangers in strange lands. They're wandering through a wilderness of the spirit, and they have to somehow live in the tension between fear and hope. So let's keep them in mind and appreciate how blessed we are in so many ways, that we don't suffer these traumas as they do. If we believe that God is the source of both love and justice, then Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others can together exemplify imitatio Dei, emulating God, by combating hatred and violence perpetrated by anyone in the name of religion. In so doing, we can ensure that the lives and the dignity of our fellow human beings, each of us created in the divine image, will be enshrined as sacred values above any theology, any creed, any professed devotion to God. This year, during Lent, Ramadan, and the Passover season, we Jews, Christians, and Muslims have a shared opportunity to renounce our self-centered worldviews that privilege our understanding of holiness over others, and that too often prevent us from acting out of inclusive love and compassion when the well-being of others is threatened. May the Almighty help us forge an alliance of all believers to preserve the true image of God as cosmic lover and savior in a time when this image is being desecrated by Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others throughout our world. And can I hear an amen? Amen. All right. Okay, that's the temporal dimension. For the spatial dimension, talking about both the desert and the holy city, I'll start by saying we Jews see ourselves as pilgrims on a journey from Mount Sinai to Jerusalem, wherever we are. This figuratively I'm speaking now. It's an archetypal journey with the Holy of Holies as the ultimate destination on earth, whatever the celestial Jerusalem might mean for Jews or for Christians. But Judaism is a very down-to-earth tradition, and we leave notions of the afterlife, which we uphold, we leave it as a secondary, if not tertiary, concern. We'll know what it is when we get there. Okay, and that's a whole conversation which we can get into. So Jerusalem is the sacred epicenter which we face 3 times a day in prayer. For Muslims, you may not know, it was the first Qibla, it was their first epicenter for about 17 months until Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, changed it to Mecca. So, okay, first I want to speak a bit about the spiritual dimension of being in the desert. Now, when I lived in Jerusalem, I made it at least once a year, a commitment to go down south into the Negev desert, on at least one occasion into the Sinai desert, to get out of the city and have a different experience of myself in the presence of God. Walter Kaufman, a religious philosopher, has a book called Religions in 4 Dimensions: Existential, Aesthetic, Historical, Comparative. And he has a section at the end of this beautiful book which he calls Landscape and Religion. And it begins with a picture of the Sinai desert near El Arish in Egypt. And his thesis is that the desert landscape is conducive to monotheism. The vastness, the silence, the barrenness, the lack of distractions, the connection with nature and the open space, it's a fertile ground for the monotheistic conception of religion, with one creator God and a universe created by this one and only God. Kaufman writes, an agricultural society depends on many powers and therefore often has different gods and goddesses for the sun, the rain, and storm, and above all, fertility cults that often involve death and resurrection. A richly varied landscape may also favor nymphs and satyrs and spirits of woods and waterfalls. In the desert, the one God, once proclaimed, does not meet with such distracting competition. Of course, if one remembers foreign cults that one encountered long before entering the desert, as the Israelites remembered Egypt, one might still be tempted to worship a golden calf. But the real competition would begin only as one entered the promised land and there found a settled agricultural society with Baalim and Ashtaroth, natural objects being worshipped as deities. That's the end of a quote from Kaufman. I think that's a good foundation to begin this reflecting on what the desert means spiritually. And it helps to explain why the Israelites had to wander for 40 years in the desert before they could enter the land of Canaan, and transform it into the land of Israel. One obvious reason is that the slave generation had to die out after the 12 spies were sent to scout out the land, and 10 of them came back with a bad report saying that God was inviting them to enter, but that they would be defeated. Only Joshua and Caleb said, we have to enter it right now and take possession of it. So it was quite clear that that generation of slaves who had been conditioned to be totally dependent on Pharaoh had to die out, and another generation could grow up, ready to take responsibility for their own lives. And that new generation was prepared in the desert to live in a land as farmers and merchants and as consecrators, eventually through the temple, once King Solomon built it, after David had created Jerusalem as the epicenter. The transition period between the civilized but pagan culture of Egypt and the land of Israel, which was also inhabited by polytheists, had to be a lengthy one and in a space that would break all the idols. It would smash all the false religious ideas that all cultures around were tempted by. And the Israelites, later Jews from Judah, the Southern Kingdom, they were going to be, and I would say we still are, a witnessing servant people that smashes all human idols. We are the classic iconoclasts. In my opinion, that's the basic reason that we Jews are still around. We have to be the iconoclastic rebels, the prophetic counter-witnesses, not just to the rulers who think they are divine, but also to people who worship money, land, state, ideology, or a political party as the sacred idol. The Jewish presence is to deny the divinity of any of those things and to proclaim, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Listen, O Israel, the eternal is our God and the eternal is one. That one God is the God of nature and history who has put us into nature and history to sanctify both space and time. The consciousness of space and time is radically different in the desert. Now, if you spend time in the desert, you know what I mean. And if you haven't, I invite you to sojourn a bit in the desert, wherever you can find it. Now, the number 40 has some kind of mystical resonance to it. It's not just the 40 years that the people spent in the desert. Moses was on top of Mount Sinai twice, getting 2 sets of tablets. He was there for 40 days and nights. Jesus was in the desert for 40 days after being baptized in the Jordan by John the Baptist on the edge of the desert. And there are just a few lines telling that story in the gospel, not a long account, but it mentions that he was also tempted by Satan. One of the deep psychological dimensions of the desert experience is being alone with yourself, confronting God and confronting the demons inside you. That's not something that's for everybody. But those who do spend a long time in the desert, sooner or later have to confront what Carl Jung, the psychologist, called the shadow dimension of themselves, and against the backdrop of this awesome majesty to develop the humility that comes from appreciating one's own finite, limited nature. It's the best antidote to ego inflation. In the desert, you see how little each of us really is. At the same time, you appreciate how integrated you are with God's ecology and that providence provides everything. If you can live like a Bedouin for a week, you'll know what I mean. Including water. It seems to be totally dry in the desert. But you find things growing there, which is amazing. There's a midrash on the burning bush that Moses encountered in the desert at Sinai, which says that along with the fire which could be seen was the element of water which couldn't be seen and was underground. Otherwise the bush wouldn't have grown there in the first place. Okay, and those of you who are fans of Saint-Exupéry's Le Petit Prince, the Little Prince, will remember the famous line that under the desert there is a well. Yeah. Yes, it conceals the waters of life. The desert experience invites us to look much more deeply than we otherwise would in the city. In communities of people, superficiality usually takes over. We don't have the space and the time, except maybe on Shabbat, the Sabbath. The whole purpose of Shabbat is, in a sense, a desert retreat every week. Most of our lives are spent engaging in material pursuits, which is a legitimate need. But it's a surface need in our lives and doesn't necessarily nourish our souls. And just before we went to pray together over dinner, I was saying to Father Al the difference between a vocation and a profession. You know, you can retire from a profession, but not from a vocation. And to discern the difference is good to spend some time in the desert. We have to work to feed our bodies and to support our families. We have to work but our souls are nourished by the silence and the timelessness, the sense of eternity that you have in the desert. The desert experience makes the connection with eternity and with infinity, and that's why all of the prophets, Moses, David, Jesus, Muhammad, others, spent a lot of time in the desert preparing their own inner spiritual selves for their pastoral roles. the leadership responsibilities that they would have to take on. And let me develop this point just a bit. At the end of the book of Numbers, which in Hebrew is called Bamidbar, which means in the desert, Moses is recounting all the way stations that the Israelites passed through during their period in the desert before they went across the Jordan to inherit the promised land. After all these descriptions of where they went, this was Numbers chapter 23, in the 34th chapter of Numbers, the borders of the land are delineated. Finally. Actually, they are delineated 5 different ways. So when people talk about the biblical borders, you have to say which ones you're thinking of. This juxtaposition of the journey through the wilderness for 40 years and the exact description of where the boundaries were going to be is a message that I understand to be this. For 40 years, you've grown up in the desert. All you've known is limitless space and total dependence on God. Now you're going to cross the river. Joshua's going to lead you across, and you're going to have to limit yourselves to contract your sense of space and to start marking out borders and taking responsibility for your specific territories. Every tribe will have its own space that's very clearly marked. In the course of this discussion, the Levites are mentioned. They were the only tribe that didn't get a specific territory because they were entrusted with the service in the temple. They had a different task. They were not farmers. They were consecrators, together with the Kohanim, the priests, who were a subset of the tribe of Levi. Or they were singers, or they were custodians of the temple vessels. They, in essence, were the pastoral tribe. So everybody else was farming to feed everybody's bodies, and they were feeding people's souls. In Numbers 35, verses 6 and 7, it reads, "And among the cities which you shall give to the Levites shall be 6 cities of refuge, which you shall appoint for the manslayer." That's where we get manslaughter from. That's the person who kills somebody accidentally. That person may flee there. And to them you shall add 42 cities. So the total given to the Levites is 48 cities throughout the land. The cities of refuge remind us of Elijah, the prophet, who defeated the prophets of Baal on the Carmel near the city of Haifa today, and who had to flee from the anger of Jezebel, the Phoenician queen. And where did he go? Do you remember in 1 Kings 17, 18, 19? Do you remember where he ended up, the prophet Elijah, when he ran for his life after he'd slain these 400 false prophets? He went back to the same mountain, Sinai or Horeb, where Moses had gotten the 10 Commandments. So we call them the 10 utterances or the 10 statements. Aseret HaDibrot. The same source where the Torah had been revealed. So not just any desert and not just any mountain, a very specific place. And there he had this amazing experience, a spectacular sound and light show. You know what I'm talking about? You remember this passage? You know, God wasn't in the lightning or the earthquake or the fire.
In the silence.
In none of these natural phenomena. But God, or the message, was heard next truly in what in Hebrew is Kol Demama Daka, which is usually translated, or I would say mistranslated in most English Bibles as the still small voice. Yes? Quakers are big on this in their silent meetings. Okay. But Kol Demama Daka really means the subtle voice of muteness. Little different, no? The subtle voice of muteness. The mama is muteness. Kol is voice, the mama. Daka is thin or subtle. Maybe subliminal. To me, this is the closest the Hebrew scripture gets to Zen Buddhism. You know the Zen koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Yeah, a rabbi gave me the answer to that. You want to see what is the sound of one hand clapping? You ready? Okay, what is this?
Painful sound.
What?
That's a painful sound.
Yeah. Okay. What is the sound of muteness speaking? That's at least a paradox, sounds like a contradiction. How can muteness speak? Okay, so there's no logical answer to that. But it's the silence that speaks, and that's what Elijah heard and understood. In all of these loud phenomena, the divine presence wasn't revealed, but in the silence, he heard something. A message that could be spoken through silence. We monotheists, we're obsessed with words, texts, especially holy texts. We read them, we teach them, we preach them, we interpret them, we sing them, we try to live them out. The word, das Wort. The word for word. The word in Hebrew that means word is davar. That's why we say Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances or 10 statements, rather than the 10 commandments. That's a whole other discussion. Because we count them differently. The first one, which you consider a prelude, I am the eternal your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That for us is statement number 1. And then come 9 more or less commandments or instruction. But for Christians, that prelude doesn't count as one of the 10 commandments. And then the coveting prohibition is divided into 2 to come up to keep the number 10. Okay. So that's why Elijah was brought there, in order that he could be silent. He was preaching, prophesying, but he had to be totally alone in that special place. He was preaching, prophesying a lot. He was spilling out lots of words. But at Horeb, unlike Moses, who received the 10 utterances, that wasn't Elijah's essential revelation given to him. It was through silence that communicated something much deeper than what could be spoken. And it's only in the desert that your inner ear can be attuned to the divine voice that doesn't speak in words. Maybe not even in sounds that our auditory nerves can pick up. This is conveyed, ironically, in the Hebrew word for desert. Midbar. Midbar. Can you hear the word davar, the word for word, in the word for desert? Davar is word. Dibur is speech. What I am doing now is dibur. And midbar is desert. So inside the word for desert is the word for word. Okay? And if you make it into a verb and say, Ani medaber, I am talking to you now, Ani medaber, okay? That's the present, you could say. Hu medaber, he is speaking. So that's present tense for speaking. Now, for in the masculine form, medaberet for a female. So if you put the 2 words together and you say, Hamidbar midaber, you get the desert speaks. It's the same 4 consonants. You have to vocalize, put dots underneath the letters in a special way. And Torah scrolls have no dots, no vocalization. So, Hamidbar midaber, the desert speaks. But it doesn't speak in words or even in sounds. It speaks through a frequency that only our inner ears can pick up. It's like a sixth sense. And that's why I think Moses commanded us, or God through Moses, Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel, listen. He didn't mean just listen to the words, but attune your inner ears to the non-verbal message that's between the lines, which only the desert can help you hear. And if you have 40 years to listen, sooner or later it's going to break through, right? Right, there's a good chance that you'll have some kind of revelatory experience by the end of it. And you can take that with you into the land when you have to carve out boundaries and take responsibility for growing your own food and building a whole society that is supposed to help you live out the mandate from Sinai to be a kingdom of priests and a holy people. Kingdom of priests, meaning use political power for redemptive ends. Okay. I'm going to jump to the end here. Shabbat, just a little word about going back to the temporal dimension. The Sabbath is one way, a very important way, to transcend the limits which we need for the other days of the week. 6 days a week, we need those limits in order to act in the world responsibly on some collective basis for a whole society. We can't be nomads or monks in our tradition. And I understand the desert fathers and mothers and why spending time in the desert, your whole life in the desert, allows you to elevate your spirituality to something to a level that can't be experienced elsewhere. But we Jews, we don't retreat to a cloister or a desert monastery, not for a whole life. It's a shuttle going back and forth between the desert to get reconnected to the waters of life, Mayim Chaim, which is the Torah. The Torah is compared to a sea of living waters. And that's what we try to do every Shabbat. We have a mini Sinai experience in the synagogue when we hear the portion from the Mosaic books read out. It's like standing again at Mount Sinai in the desert, the whole Israelite nation represented by all the synagogue assemblies. But after Shabbat, we have 6 working days, 6 active, proactive days, in which we try to discharge our social responsibilities after we have recharged our spiritual batteries with this virtual desert connection. Okay. You still with me? Okay. So now I want to end by reflecting a little bit on Jerusalem as the kind of counterweight to the desert experience. And these are the 2 sacred locations, do you say loci or loci? Locus, what's the, loci? Places, locations. Okay, the desert and Jerusalem as kind of complementary places.
The loci are the 2 points in the ellipse.
Right, exactly.
Loci.
Right, thanks, George. Good, thank you. Okay, what does Jerusalem mean to me? My spiritual home. By the way, I've been keeping a record of my nocturnal dreams since 1974. 90% of my dreams, I'm in Jerusalem or somewhere else in the land, the Holy Land. So even though my body's in Western Connecticut, my psyche is still linked very, very deeply, existentially, with Jerusalem. So I consider it our common historical and spiritual metropolis, from the Greek, mother city, metropolis, with its transcendent power to heal our psychological wounds, with what I would call messianic medicine, an infusion of meta-historical hope and transformation. And to help focus our attention on this sacred epicenter in space, in geography, I'm going to just return for one moment to the temporal dimension. Toward the end of April, still during Ramadan, Jews the world over and the Christians of Armenia, who have their own diaspora, including in Jerusalem. There's a whole quarter, the Armenian quarter there. Both of our communities will mark 2 solemn memorial days, commemorating 2 20th century genocides. April 28th will be Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah, memorializing the 6 million Jews who were brutally, systematically slaughtered during the Second World War. While 4 days earlier, on April 24th, Armenians will mark their annual commemoration day for the 1.5 million Armenians put to death by the Ottoman Turkish regime at the time of the First World War. I don't know if you're aware of this, but historians report that Adolf Hitler, on the eve of his blitzkrieg into Poland, September 1st, 1939, said to his general, "Who today remembers the Armenians?" Did you know that? As he anticipated, the subsequent history books would be written by his victorious Third Reich. For their part, Turkish officials continued to deny that the Ottoman campaign of mass slaughter was in fact a genocide. This governmental denial stands in the way of Armenian-Turkish reconciliation and healing, the healing grief work that Armenians are still trying to do. You know, only recently the American government finally came on board and said the truth. And the Israeli government hasn't until now, for realpolitik reasons that have to do with relationships with Turkey. For us Jews, the acknowledgement of the Holocaust by the regime of Konrad Adenauer, the German chancellor after the war, the payment of reparations to the State of Israel, and later acts of contrition by Chancellor Willy Brandt and others were positive steps that contributed to Jewish psychic rehabilitation and that helped German-Jewish relations move beyond the horrors of the Holocaust. No small miracle right there. For most Jews, the collective homecoming to Jerusalem and the Holy Land and the reemergence of Jewish sovereignty there after 2,000 years in exile is the fulfillment of biblical prophecies as well as many centuries of daily prayers. But Israeli Independence Day, which falls this year on May the 5th, will not be a time of celebration for Palestinians, since the establishment of the State of Israel still constitutes a collective nightmare and trauma for them. The fulfillment of our centuries-long dream turned into a nightmare for them. They will be mourning the Nakba on that day. The Nakba is the national catastrophe that befell them in 1948 when close to 750,000 Palestinians either fled their homes or were forcibly expelled by the Israeli military. Today is March 30th, right? In the Gregorian calendar. It's also today in Israel, Palestine. It is Land Day, Yom HaAdamah. It commemorates the deaths in 1976 of 6 Arab Israelis who were protesting the Israeli government's expropriation of land that their families and communities owned in the Galilee. For decades, you get a sense that dates are very important to me. Yes, I take time very seriously. And I don't want to take up too much of yours. So I'm going to end in just a few minutes. Then we'll have a conversation. For decades, as Palestinian exiles languished in refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, and neighboring countries, Israeli officials denied that mass expulsions had taken place in 1948, adding insult to the collective injuries suffered by Palestinians. More recent historical accounts and even statements by some government leaders in Israel have acknowledged that up to 50% of the refugees from 48 were forcibly displaced during Israel's War of Independence. But even with this incomplete and less than official acknowledgement, most Israeli Jews view what happened then as a military or political necessity, and they justify it as part of a population exchange that included the forced exodus of Jews from Arab countries following the fighting in 48-49. Now, how do we move beyond self-referencing historical narratives and victim scripts that compete for validation? This is where the deep diplomacy has to happen, and politicians and secular diplomats are not trained to do that kind of pastoral, transformative work. As different communities recall moments in time according to their their subjective experiences, there's at least one spatial or geographic coordinate that offers hope for healing the collective wounds of history, and that, I submit to you, is the holy city of Jerusalem. This idea may seem strange to you given the ongoing dispute between Israelis and Palestinians over control of the city, but my perspective goes beyond politics. Having lived there for close to 25 years, I often reflect on the verses in the 87th Psalm suggesting that all believers in the one God are symbolically born in her. Kol mai naibach, all my wellsprings are in you. The psalmist envisions everyone having, in essence, two birth certificates. Read it again. See if this resonates with you. Psalm 87. One recording the emergence of her or his or their body into this world, and the other testifying to the birth of the person's soul in Jerusalem eons ago at the time of creation. Within the walls of Jerusalem's old city, Armenians, Jews, and Palestinians live in adjacent quarters. On the level of the physical body, all three national communities have endured massacres over the last century. Two of them, as I mentioned, on a genocidal scale. So all three are survivor peoples, suffering servant communities who've experienced death and resurrection and acting as witnesses to the triumph of the Spirit over horrific suffering. On the spiritual and the emotional levels, all three peoples have experienced exile from their homelands, being refugees or strangers in strange lands. At a time when we're witnessing again another mass refugee crisis in Europe, on top of the tens of millions of refugees worldwide, can there be some transcendent lesson in this interface of sorrows and aspirations for homecoming and healing? That's an open question. The image I have, and that I'll end with, is of three traumatized individuals walking through a kind of wilderness in darkness and holding flickering candles to illumine their way. Candles lit by their ancestors to get them through the dark nights of the soul. Three wandering pilgrims yearning to return home, afraid that out of the darkness some old or new enemy will attack them. Afraid of perpetual victimization and the prospect even of total annihilation. Afraid to trust others who might help them overcome their trauma and dread. And then suddenly the three frightened pilgrims converge in the Holy Mother City. The light of their candles revealing each other's faces as each experiences the shock of mutual recognition. That's a political term, but I'm using it in a different context here. For in the human faces is the reflection of something mysteriously divine. Each of them can echo to the others the exclamation of the wounded Jacob, renamed Israel, and paradoxically blessed as he was reunited with his estranged brother Esau in Genesis chapter 23, following his nocturnal struggle with a mysterious supernatural adversary. So Jacob said when he met his fraternal twin after 20 years, I see your face as though I am seeing the face of God. That's where we need to get to. So this transcendent sense of Jerusalem as our common mother city, as Jesus saw it, as like a mother hen protecting her chicks, when he said, you do not know the things from me that make for peace, as he watched the holy city from the Mount of Olives. This sense helps us face one another as siblings in the sacred family drama that is still unfolding in our lives, all our lives. This faith conviction is what can strengthen our hope for the healing of our world and the realization of true shalom. Salam. Peace. Thanks for indulging me. And now I hope we can share what's on our hearts and minds. I'll turn the microphone. You want to take this? Or
I think we could just speak
Okay, speak loudly. If necessary, I'll repeat it because it's being recorded. George. Yes, the coffee bearer, yes.
There you go. Tell us something about the theology of Satan. We hear about him in Genesis. We hear about him in Job. We hear Jesus telling Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." So can you tell us a little bit of...
A little bit.
Yeah, 'cause
A little bit about a big subject.
I've been studying your fellow Harvard graduate, Elaine Pagels.
Yes, a brilliant scholar. Well, not all Jews will answer the same way about anything, but specifically on this subject, not all Christians have the same view of Hasatan. Okay, we don't have a whole developed theology or philosophy of what the satanic force in the universe is. We don't really have a developed view of the devil, Teufel in German. So you said already, George, from Genesis. So you think that the snake, the serpent, is a representation of the satanic, huh?
Well, there are 2 or 3 Jewish names for Satan, in my understanding. And I thought one of them came from the Genesis story.
Hanahash, the serpent, the tempter. In your evensong reading, Paul was saying, yes, so the snake tempted the woman, and then she led to the fall, right? That whole anti-womanist theology. This is not part of our tradition. Let me tell you this. Yes. Okay. Okay. I don't want to put the cart before the horse. Hasatan is understood as the accuser. Okay, if it's an external force. Okay, we don't have really a developed notion of a fallen angel like Iblis in the Islamic tradition or Lucifer in the Christian tradition. In the book of Job, which you didn't mention, George, in the first half of this kind of frame, Hasatan, the Satan, the accuser, is saying, yeah, you think this Job is such a righteous person, why don't you make him suffer and test his faith, his fidelity to you? So I consider all these allegorical literary allusions, okay? I don't take it literally, I take it literarily. Here, rabbinic religious anthropology understands the human personality, the human psyche, as torn from our youth, at least from puberty and onward, as an inner struggle between Yetzer HaTov, the impulse to do good, and Yetzer Hara, the impulse to do bad, to harm others and ultimately ourselves. So that we have to take responsibility for, because that's how we have been programmed in order to be morally free and responsible, accountable agents. If we were controlled by God, the devil, or angels, we would just say, I was just following orders, or they made me do it. Well, I didn't do it. Satan possessed me. Okay, now I do believe in the phenomenon of demonic possession, and I understand that exorcism sometimes is necessary and works, and most traditions have some teachings about demonology. So I'm not going to give you any definitive answer, George. I'll just say that this is a deep mystery within the plan of God. I don't believe there is a cosmological war going on between God and Satan. I don't believe that. That's a dangerous thing, even, that dualistic cosmology, because it leads to what I'm going to share this in 30 seconds, but this is an opening for a weeks-long conversation at the very least, okay? If the notion of the incarnation can apply to the divine becoming enfleshed in Jesus Christ, yes? Okay, that's part of your fundamental understanding of how God's universe works. As a sign of saving grace and the reconciliation between fallen humanity and the God of creation. Our understanding of the expulsion from the garden is not a fall from grace that needs God to become one of us, to suffer and die as an atoning Lamb of God. That's not because we don't believe in the premise, the fall. We don't believe we need somebody, a Savior in human form. So we just have a different understanding. So we don't have a dualistic universe, that God is in charge, and for ways we cannot understand, but it seems to me has something to do with being free, truly free. Not as free as God. God is infinitely free, but relatively free, at least morally responsible. So to put it on Satan, I think, is a way to absolve ourselves of responsibility. That's my deepest concern. Okay, I don't know whether that does justice. You asked a very simple question, and I tried to flesh it out, maybe more than you bargained for, George.
You did good.
Really?
I'm going to talk to another Jewish person and get another version.
You certainly will.
No,
Maybe you talk to me in another year and you'll get a different version. But that's my best answer at this moment. I wrestle with this too.
Dr. Landau, I do have I loved your conversation about the desert and wilderness, and in that silence, in the desert, all stimuli are gone, and in that deep silence, you find a sense of an existential experience of nothingness, and you might be despairing, but in that moment of despair, God comes. And that's what I sense in the prophetic tradition. I mean, in Elijah and in Moses, when they're at the point where they're just leaving it all and they're just listening to that moment of silence. And I think about even the pandemic experience, right, where we were forced as a global community to be sequestered in some way. We were at home. We didn't have the normal stimuli that we usually have as we went about the workday and all these things. We were kind of sequestered, and maybe even in front of the TV or the laptop. And I remember that experience of despair for me. I mean, I remember not being able to come to church, to do services, to be with my people. I was lost. And it was interesting because but in that moment, in that feeling of loss, feeling that sense of loss, I also found it's an act of faith, but also that was really, really nurtured the presence of God there. Somehow God would make it right. If I could almost, because when you talked about this still small voice, what do you hear? When you hear silence, I heard, don't worry, it'll be okay. I think what I'm trying to put, we're not in the desert. We're in Westfield, Rhode Island. Right? Maybe no. It's got water all over us. But there's a sense that even if we're not physically in a desert, we could be mentally, spiritually.
Yes, you can program that into your life. And if you do it in a disciplined way,
Like Shabbat.
periodically, yes, it reinforces that sense of divine presence paradoxically in the midst of silence and vastness. No limits.
And I looked at the description you say about the desert, no sense of time.
Clock time.
Huh?
You were talking about Kairos before,
Yeah, I was
right?
talking about Kairos before.
Yeah, no Chronos, but Kairos.
Yeah,
Yes.
the sense of time, like you don't know when the day begins and ends almost, right?
Right.
And it's like, in that experience, I remember feeling, even in the pandemic, in the midst of it, the sense of, there's like the normal rhythms are upset. There's no beginning or end, there's no middle, there's just all one day. I don't know if that was your experience, it was mine. It was disoriented.
It surely is, yes, because we orient our time around clocks, watches. Yes. Thanks for sharing that. There was excuse me for going back to George for a second, because there was a loose end. I didn't finish a thought, okay, about a dualistic cosmology. Because if you believe that the divine can become incarnate, and you believe that God and Satan are at war, and we, our souls, are the battlefield, then you are likely to think that Satan will become incarnate too, and that cosmological war of the angels of light and darkness going on somewhere in the celestial realm is being fought through representatives here. And there the danger is demonic projection. And you are looking at a representative of a community that was the prime candidate for demonic projection in the Christian imagination, because who could have the power to kill God on a cross? That is a cosmic crime, deicide. Well, who are the satanic representatives on earth that actually put God or God's Son to death on the cross? Well, it wasn't the Roman soldiers, but we were conveniently there. And Jesus was one of us. All the disciples were Jewish. Right? So, these are not just speculative ideas. These have real-world consequences. Theology is a very consequential enterprise. And when you make Satan into a cosmic force with representatives on earth, the next step is to feel they need to be fought to the death. They need to be destroyed. All in the name of the most holy, right? And then you end up with crusades and other unholy wars. Yes, what's your name? Alan.
Well, that's what we did in World War II. We personified Hitler as a devil, and a lot of people are calling Putin the same thing right now.
That's okay, that's an observation. You want me to respond to that? Because I wrestle with that, Alan. Especially,
how do you wrestle with that?
No, I wrestle with that because when I look at Leni Riefenstahl's The Triumph of the Will or other film depictions of the Führer, I mean, this is a human being who is an agent of demonic energy.
Yeah.
Now, was he possessed and used as an instrument, or is this just a warped soul who went astray and without external manipulation? I do not know, but that was as close to a satanic or demonic energy, let's call it Nazism, with him at the center of this destructive force that consumed the world for a time. And my parents were refugees from Vienna in 1938, so my life has been personally deeply impacted by that period. Now, okay, and now we have Vladimir in Moscow versus Jewish Volodymyr in Kiev at this very moment. Now, what does that mean? Okay, I won't go into the whole thing about Ukrainian history and the Cossacks who killed Jews. It's amazing role reversal in many ways. Something very deep is going on meta-historically, which I don't have a grasp on.
What was the word you used, metaphorically?
Meta-historically. Something beyond human history. This is something beyond. Is there something is happening? We are all in it. We are in it. We are in some really cosmic drama of transformation, and I hope and pray that this will end up being there'll be a positive outcome here. Deep things in terms of weapons of mass destruction, which just raised the scale of horror. Another place that is a holy place, but for a very different reason, are Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've been to Hiroshima, and a very, very indelible memory from that experience. As an American citizen and as a Jew coming from Jerusalem, all of that wrapped up together. So God forbid such weapons would be unleashed again, anywhere on this planet. But we Americans need to take responsibility for that. Those were war crimes, whatever Harry Truman said. Okay? And I recommend a book called Meeting at Potsdam. This is how the pieces of the puzzle fit together, by Charles Mee, a historian of that period. The Japanese were already defeated, but Stalin and the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan in the first days of August 1945, and they still have the Kuril Islands till this day. They took the Kuril Islands from Japan. The Cold War was already heating up, right? The Russian Empire was occupying Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, when Harry Truman said, I have to show that bastard in the Kremlin that I can be as ruthless as he is. And he had just met him at Potsdam, right? FDR had died. Yalta was history, now it's Potsdam with Truman, sizing up Joe Stalin. And Charles Mee argues, the real audience, the address for those two weapons were Joseph Stalin and not Emperor Hirohito or the Japanese. Take that to heart, okay? If that's true, and it's a compelling case he makes in this book, what does that mean for us as Americans? What are we accountable for? Yes.
Yeah.
What's your name?
Marlies. And
Marlies?
I grew up in Germany, and this all brings a lot of thoughts to my mind and feelings.
I bet.
We did a program here about 3 years ago that was called Engaging the Powers by Walter Wink.
Yes, I knew Walter Wink.
Okay, oh, you did? Okay.
Yes, I did.
I thought that was a very fascinating program. While I personally don't believe in the devil at the horns, I think there is a collective force that becomes evil because we all, maybe on some level, contribute to it, and then it becomes bigger than us, and it feels like an evil force is overruling everything else. And I think that's what happened in Germany at that time. I think that's what happened with the attack of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It happens, but where was I going with that? I remember there's a book called An Interrupted Life by Eddie Hillison. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
There is one place where she said, this is like a diary that's like a little bit like Anne Frank, but she's an adult. And at
yes.
one point she says, no one human being can do that much evil all by themselves. And she recognized this taking over of a collective evilness. I just wanted to say that. But the other thing is there is also a force of goodness that is bigger than any one of us. And I was at URI maybe a few months ago. They had a lecture, and I wish I could remember. There was a rabbi and a Palestinian man, and they traveled through the country together. They talk about this organization.
Roots?
Yeah.
Yes, they are personal, dear friends of mine. Hanan Schlesinger, I know over 40 years.
Okay.
He was at my wedding.
Can you say a little bit about Roots? I thought that was so powerful on the good side, what they're doing.
Yes, these are Jewish settlers, residents of the occupied territories, and Palestinians who live there, and they are neighbors, and they live in two separate worlds most of the time and never meet, and they project all kinds of negative qualities on the other. And this is a way to rehumanize, or maybe humanize for the first time, the two sides. When I was directing this Building Abrahamic Partnerships program at then Hartford Seminary, I brought Rabbi Hanan and Ali Abu Awad from Israel-Palestine to be in that course for a week, and we filled the meeting room, Joel, on a Wednesday night during that course. It was filled to overflowing for a public presentation by these two.
They take care of children together, they cook together.
Yeah, it's great. Just Google Roots.
Yeah.
Roots,
Yeah.
Shorashim in Hebrew, Judur is roots in Arabic. Yes, this is the only framework I know of peace building between Jewish settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank. Yes, it's a sign of hope and promise. Yes, that even there, these connections, deep connections, can be made.
They're separate. Is one in the Palestinian on the Palestinian side and the other? I'm lost a little bit.
Okay, they're all outside the borders of the State of Israel,
Yeah.
the 1949 armistice line. They're in the occupied West Bank, and they're neighbors. You have Jews who were sent there by the government, yes, into these settlements, these communities, and they are now beginning to interact as equals, not as occupiers occupied, with their Palestinian neighbors. Yes.
I can visualize that.
So take a look at the books on the table. Make a note of anyone that appeals to you. We have one last question.
Yes, I have a question about the Hebrew calendar.
Okay.
The Jewish year begins with Rosh Hashanah, usually in September, October.
Yes.
And how did they come to figure out the age of the world, the Jewish people, as 5,700 something? And also the calendar, the Hebrew calendar, it doesn't numerically follow the Gregorian calendar at all. How many months are there in the Hebrew calendar?
12. Okay. Okay, what did you want to know about Rosh Hashanah? How they
find out 5,000?
Oh, the 5,771. Well, that's, let's say, by connecting the dots on how many generations, who begat whom, until you end up with the patriarchs. Okay, somebody figured out, reading Genesis, that it has to be so many years ago, and so we're in 5771, I think, at this point. Okay, but I don't believe that. Okay, I understand that, but this is in the pre-scientific age. Now we have carbon-14 and other dating tools that we know that the universe is billions of years old. So, how do you square that discrepancy? Okay? First of all, the arch traditionalists, the literalists, I didn't even know, let's say literalists, The late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was trained as a scientist and engineer, believed, despite scientific evidence, that the world was created, if he were alive today, he would say 5,771 years ago, with fossils. God was kind of tricking us, or fooling us, or challenging us. But the fossils were created with the world. Okay, that's untenable to me as a critically thinking person. Okay, so I have read Orthodox scholars who say, how do we end up with billions of years before the human beings entered the picture? And then we can count, let's say, obviously humanity's been around for more than 5,771 years. But the idea of not taking this literally is to realize that when it talks about 7 days of creation in Genesis chapter 1, yes, what does a day mean? And the psalmist says, 1,000 years are like a day in your sight. Well, a day in Earth time, one rotation of the planet Earth, right, is a day, is 24 hours, according to our measurements of time. But the sun, the moon, the earth, they didn't arrive until the third day. So what does a day mean before the earth even came into existence? So this is why I read the Bible extremely seriously, but not literally. Okay? It is not a history book. It's a book to guide us in how to live a holier life. Okay? The Muslims would say the same about the Holy Quran. So, but I understand, if you live in an environment where you are taught a certain way of reading and interpreting Scripture, and it's never challenged, then you may have a rude awakening later on when you try to reconcile what seem to be contradictory ideas. Then you're in a deep quandary, and you may reject it all, sadly, because you've been set up to not understand how these different elements cohere. They don't cohere in many ways. So I'm following your cue. There's a woman there who wants...
My favorite biblical quote from the Old Testament is, "My ways are not your ways, and my thoughts are not your thoughts."
Yes.
And I totally believe that. So whatever God has done or is doing is His way, His thoughts, and there's nothing to do with ours. And I just, a lot of it just goes right under there. I think God is God.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us of that profound truth.
Imagine what He thinks.
Okay, I'll leave you with the most challenging and consoling verse in the whole of the Hebrew Bible for me. Okay? And then I'll stop. And we can all go home. It's Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, the last chapter in Genesis, where Joseph says to his brothers, after they buried their father Jacob back in the old country, in Hebron, in Arabic today, Al-Khalil, named for Abraham, Abuna Ibrahim Al-Khalil Allah, our forefather Abraham, the friend of God. Hebron also comes from Chaber, meaning friend. It should be the friendliest place in the Holy Land, but it's not by any means. Joseph says to his brothers, who are afraid that he'll now take revenge on them with their father dead, so the father won't see the suffering of more of his children. He said, no, you don't understand what's been going on. What you meant to do unto me for evil, God transformed for the good, because my being second to Pharaoh has saved the whole family, in fact, all of Egypt, from famine. So yes, I was a conceited kid, and my dreams put me above you. But look, it all came true. But not in the way that it's me against you, or there's antagonism. This is God's saving grace for us all. So when I see what's going on now in Ukraine, or I see what's going on now in Israel-Palestine, where there have been 5 terror attacks killing innocent Israelis in the last week, including 5 in Bnei Barak yesterday. And this is people who identify with the Islamic State. Notice I said Islamist extremists and not Islamic extremists. We have to be very careful with our language and not demonize all Muslims. But what's going on now, this is what's gotten me through my dark nights of the soul. That verse. I don't understand. This is horror. Mariupol is being bombed out of existence with hundreds of people suffering, civilians being killed. Okay, since I don't believe death is the end of it and their souls will be enlisted for salvific work on another plane, but little babies, children, they deserve to live longer lives on this plane. So what redemptive result will come from this horror, I don't know yet, and it depends partly on us, right? On us. We're all implicated here. We're all neighbors, no matter where we are in space. We are spiritual brothers and sisters, and we need to come together. And I feel blessed to be together with you tonight, talking about these really deep things as we prepare for our holidays of liberation, transformation.
Stay for a little bit longer. You can ask any question you want to. I think Dr. Landau will be available to us, but for those of us who have other things to do and places to be, please thank you for being with us today. And Dr. Landau, thank you for the insight that you've given. It's really wonderful to know. Thank you.